Ridgeline, beating the hot dogs, Coach Major Turnbow, 11-time repeating state champs, 8-mile warm-up, 15 points. "Where are all their varsity guys?" said Swart, as the Ridgeline buses unloaded onto the parking lot of our course. Bowden stared as well. "Widner, Moats, Biddle, Slazenger, Christie," he said, rattling off the names of Ridgeline's ridiculously good regular scoring five. "None of them are on there." "Neither are Russo or Thompson," said Slade. "None of them." "Maybe they were all sick," said Squid. Nobody dignified his remark with a comment. Even Victor allowed it to slide. They were too confused by the absence of our competition to waste their energy on Squid. It was the middle of September. The weather had turned glorious. 75 degrees every day and long afternoons of the clearest daylight, the deepest blue skies, and cool nights with almost no humidity that allowed you to open the bedroom window wide and not wake up in a moist bed. Our first dual meet of the year was under our belts. It had been a success primarily because we ran against the Frankfurt hot dogs. Frankfurt's best runner couldn't break 18 minutes, and he was the only one on their team who stuck with us as we packed it up in the first mile, going through in 5:20. Slade then went on to regain his dignity after the Hokum Karam debacle. The last two-thirds of the race, his summer miles, were in evidence as he powered through to a 16:47 and claimed the number one gray hoodie for his own. Keenan and my brother, now known as the Champ, or just Champ, due to his supreme auto-stimulatory feats, followed him in just over 17 minutes. Keen out-kicking Hyder for second. My lack of training throughout August showed itself, and I struggled in nearly a minute behind my Bluebird brothers. At that point in the season, my legs were aching. While the cramps in my feet had ceased, going down steps was a challenge. Also, one of my toenails was black. I showed Bowden, but he was unimpressed. "That one's a goner," he said. "Cut your toenails or you lose more." Victor was our fourth, 50 meters in front of me. We'd gone 1 through 5 for a perfect cross-country score of 15 points. Even though Coach told us on the bus ride home that Frankfurt sucked and we shouldn't let our perfect score go to our heads, we'd felt pretty good about ourselves. That was until we grasped the fact that our next meet was a showdown with the bullies next door, the Ridgeline Salukis. I mentioned that many people hated the Salukis. It was mostly sour grapes, as they were the best team in the state, and the rest of us, at least on some level, wished we were them. But there was more to it as well. The Salukis didn't just beat you, they beat you down. This had everything to do with their coach, a legend by the name of Major Turnbow. Turnbow came to our county in Indiana in the mid-'70s at the start of the first running boom in America, the one driven by Jim Fixx's famous book, The Complete Book of Running, which sold over 1 million copies. Turnbow was in his 20s then, and he immediately turned Ridgeline into a cross-country power. It helped that the little town of Ridgeline grew by leaps and bounds just before and during his era, and became known as the suburb of Indy you moved to if you wanted to be a success. Rumor was most of the Ridgeline runners drove BMWs or Mercedes-Benzes to morning practice. This was just one of many reasons to hate them. Turnbow ran with his runners every day, and the intensity of their workouts became the stuff of legend. A former college runner who couldn't give up the Spartan lifestyle or the intense competition, Turnbow was a coach who actually ran with his team, and in his early days could beat all of them, even the state champs. He was among the first of what is now common. He was an actual running coach. Before him, cross-country and track coaches were most often simply gym teachers, told by their principals that they had to watch over a bunch of skinnies from September till November. These were coaches whose idea of a cross-country workout was running around the high school's cinder track 10 times. Turnbow was an entirely different species from those guys. A graduate of the prestigious and famously free-thinking Oberlin College, he could have been nearly anything, a lawyer, a doctor, a CEO. But he loved running and had the kind of independent mind that allowed him to ignore the conventions of his time, which dictated that smart, ambitious people didn't become high school cross-country coaches. He coached because it was what he most wanted to do, and as hard as he pressed his athletes and as intense and harsh as he could be with them, his runners loved him for taking them as seriously as he did. They responded by winning 11 state championships in a row, and seemed a lock to win my freshman year as well and make it 12. The legends about Ridgeline extended beyond Coach Turnbow to his runners and their workouts. Some of Turnbow's early athletes, it was said, had run marathons regularly during season. They logged the mileage necessary, sometimes nearly 100 miles a week, so why not? It was often said that the second best team in the state was Ridgeline's JV. What we didn't know on that beautiful early fall day as we scanned the buses for Ridgeline's Varsity 7 was that we were about to become the stuff of Ridgeline cross-country lore ourselves, and not in a good way. "Coach!" shouted Slade as after he and Bowden and Sword had affirmed that Ridgeline's Varsity 7 weren't on the bus. "What's going on? Where's their varsity?" Coach shrugged. "How do I know? We run against whoever they put on the line. We run against ourselves. What do I care where they are?" This wasn't good enough for Bowden. "I'm going to find out," he said, and he marched over towards the Ridgeline buses to see what he could see. The Ridgeline athletes all wore maroon and silver Adidas warm-ups. There must have been nearly 80 of them, enough to require 2 buses, and each of them, I saw to my envy, carried a dark red Adidas bag with Ridgeline written on the side in impressive block letters. Also on their bags were their last names, stitched in silver thread under the sleek silhouette of a Saluki stretched out in full stride, the Saluki being an ancient and regal Persian greyhound. Outfitted like a nation marching in the Olympic opening ceremonies, they looked rich and confident, and they didn't just look it, they were. I was suddenly not amused by Squid's laziness, and I was suddenly very conscious of Victor's beat-up Cutlass with its ashtray full of cigarette butts sitting next to the Ridgeline buses. I was ashamed of my baggy, oversized gray sweats with the number 5 written under the chin in Coach's hand. Everything about us seemed tawdry and insufficient in the face of the mighty cross-country machine that Major Turnbow had built. Bowden stopped several Ridgeline runners as they walked to set up camp. I couldn't hear, but his gestures indicated the questions he was asking. The answer he got first seemed to confuse him. A puzzled look crossed his face, then his eyes grew wide in surprise. Following one last question, his thick black eyebrows furrowed in anger. He shook his head in what looked like disgust at what he'd just heard. The Saluki to whom he was talking gave him an apologetic look, then shrugged and carried on with his business. "What's up?" asked Victor when Bowden returned to us. Bowden began to speak, but then laughed and rolled his eyes. He took a deep breath. It seemed he was delaying bad news of some sort. "What's going on?" said Slade. He was already getting hot, even though he didn't know why. Bowden laughed again. But it was clear that what he was laughing about wasn't really funny. It was a laugh to keep from yelling, cursing, and throwing a tantrum. "Their varsity's not here yet," he said finally. "They're on their way." "What do you mean?" asked Swart. "They're on another bus?" By this time, our entire varsity had formed a circle around Bowden. All in our gray sweats, we looked like a bunch of bums compared to the Ridgeline runners in their expensive customized sweatsuits. "They're not on another bus," said Bowden. His smile faded completely. He just looked worried. "Damn," shouted Slade, "just tell us." "They're running here," said Bowden quickly, as if making a confession. "What?" said Swart, his eyes wide. "The guy I talked to said they're running here." "It's 10 goddamn miles to Ridgeline," said Victor. "More like 8, said Swart thoughtfully. "Shit," he whispered. "They could do that." He looked up at the rest of us, a deep frown on his face. "I can't believe they are, but they could. It's just about the right distance, not too far." While Keenan and I had learned to live by the rule of keeping our mouths shut and seeing what happened next, it seemed my brother would never learn that strategy. "We'll kill them," said Hyder happily. "They'll be totally worn out after running that far." But the grim looks on the more experienced Hawks and Eagles' faces showed they agreed with Swart and believed otherwise. "They run that far most mornings," said Swart. "They train like animals. They're used to it." Nobody seemed to have anything to say until finally Bowden spoke up. "One of 2 things will happen here today," he said, his voice quiet and tight. "Either their real varsity is going to run here and they're going to beat us after an 8-mile warm-up, or they're going to run their JV and they're going to beat us. Either way, we look like a bunch of complete losers." "But we can beat them," said Hyder. Keenan and I disappeared a little then, stepping slightly back and out of the tight circle we'd formed. "Look, champ," said Swart, always the logical realist. "Their JV runners are better than most teams' varsity." He ran his hand through his blonde hair, and it immediately fell back into a bowl shape around his head. They'll all be under 17. They're JV scorers. Maybe they'll run their real varsity, said Hyder, looking for some hope in the situation. That'll be worse, whined Victor. They'll kick our asses, then turn around and run back home. It was about then that a quiet cheer and a smattering of clapping arose from the Ridgeline camp. The Ridgeline Varsity 7, led by Coach Major Turnbow, the legend himself, came running into the parking lot, finishing the easy 8 miles along country roads they'd just logged. They ran in a tight pack and seemed fresh and ready to race. It turned out that we did run against their actual varsity, who had just run from their town to ours before the race, and it turned out that they would post a perfect score of 15 on us. And it turned out that they would run back to their school following our race, lugging 19 or 20 for the day with a mildly hard effort sandwiched in the middle. It also turned out that I came to understand why some people wish the Ridgeline buses would crash and burn, their coaches and athletes roast in their expensive Adidas warm-ups. I learned that day that there are few better fuels to drive an athlete than pure, unadulterated hatred of an opponent.